Salutations, respected viewers. So this video is going to be more about the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to go over the factors that led up to the resignation of Captain Terence O'Neill, who was Prime Minister. People sometimes refer to him by his military rank, being not that long after the Second World War. Captain is as high as he rose, and his arch enemy, the Reverend Ian Paisley, often called him Captain O'Neill. So one of the real game changers in the late 60s was just how active NICRA was, the Civil Rights Association. It had been founded in 1968, and John Hume was one of its luminaries. Austin Currie, a nationalist politician, was also prominent in it. Anyway, the Civil Rights Association had 5 demands. One was a point system for allocating housing, such as so there could be no longer nepotism or indeed sectarian discrimination. Number 2 was employment must be solely on the basis of merit. There must be no denominational favoritism. Number 3 is there must be the vote for all adults aged over 21, whether householders are not, for local government elections. For Westminster elections, there already was the vote for all over 21, with exceptions of those in prison or the mentally ill and so forth. Number 4 was the disbandment of the B Specials. Remember, they're part-time police officers. And number 5 was an end to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is drawing electoral district boundaries in such a way as to advantage one party or other. So people in NICRA were often members of political parties. NICRA was not a political party, did not seek election. The Nationalist Party had plenty of people in it. The Northern Ireland Labour Party, even a few moderate unionists were there. Some IRA men had joined NICRA as well. The IRA had wound up its campaign in 1962. There had been some explosions in 1966, but only in the south of Ireland, like Easter Monday that year. They blew up the statue of Lord Nelson on O'Connell Street in Dublin. Could very easily have killed people, even though it was very early in the morning. But anyway, Ivan Cooper was a member of NICRA. He's a Northern Ireland Labour Party MP. He sat for a largely Catholic constituency in Derry. He said it was inspired by Gandhi. There was one case that NICRA latched onto. That was of an 18-year-old secretary of a local unionist MP. She was unmarried and she got a council house, whereas a Catholic family with several children did not. This woman was a Protestant. She was engaged to a B Special. Now, was this discrimination? On a sectarian basis, possibly, or was it because she had connections to someone who was powerful? Could be the latter. All right, it could be both. But Currie said, "If I waited 1,000 years, I wouldn't get a better case than this." As in, it was so atypical. But they chose to go with that because it was eye-catching. So there was growing unionist opposition to O'Neill. There was muttering in the ranks of his own party. The more long-term reasons why he resigned. He was 49 when he stood down. He'd already been Prime Minister for 6 years. He wasn't going to go on forever. Let me see. He didn't have interpersonal skills. His manner was a bit too patrician. He was behind the times in that sense. The Conservative Party had got rid of Alec Douglas-Home and brought in Edward Heath, who came from a lower middle-class background. And Paisley, his father was a Baptist minister, but he came from more of an ordinary background, could connect to the working class. O'Neill was about big house and estate unionism, whereas Paisley was about housing estate unionism. And he spoke with an Ulster accent. He didn't have a cut-class accent like O'Neill. Other things, yeah. O'Neill didn't seem to know the names of many MPs in his own party, and there were only about 25 of them. So he didn't pay them much respect or heed. And he believed that he could win over significant numbers of Catholics to unionism. Other unionists thought that was for the birds. As de Tocqueville said, when a system tries to reform itself, that's the most dangerous moment. Because for radicals, reform can't go far or fast enough. For reactionaries, any reform is completely unacceptable. There are reformers like O'Neill who are tentative, who are not quite sure how quickly they can go, how much they can reform, and they're pulled one way or the other. He was frightening the horses on his own side. NICRA had been holding demonstrations. There were loyalist counter-demonstrations. An organisation briefly existed called the Ulster Constitution Defence Committee, which were people who just tried to block NICRA getting through and threatened to beat them up. So Paisley was probably anti-Catholic. Well, he said it himself. You could call me anti-Catholic, but I love the poor dupes, really. He said that at a rally at Armagh. Now, he would often say he was against Catholicism, not the people. However, this distinction was a bit too academic for many of his supporters. But O'Neill had denounced Paisley, hinting that he was a fascist, saying, for those of us who remember the 1930s, the pattern is horribly familiar. This contempt for established authority, monster meetings, the appeal to a perverted form of patriotism, seeing reasonableness as weakness, and so forth. Anyway, Paisley was even jailed briefly for riotous assembly. So we talked about the Burntollet Bridge incident, and then O'Neill standing down in 1969. He was succeeded by Sir James Chichester Clark. People often say Chichester Clark was O'Neill's cousin. Well, that's true, although they were very distant cousins. In the tiny aristocracy in Northern Ireland, most of them were related to each other. Other things I should point out, he had also been to Eton, so I suppose it wasn't really moving on in terms of class and getting in someone who was middle class or working class to be Prime Minister. And Chichester Clark also spoke with that Pucker accent. Chichester Clark had gone along with the reforms in the early stages, but felt this was too much, it weakened the Unionist position. The serious numbers of Catholics were never going to be won over to Unionism. Now, some hardline loyalists objected to any reconciliation with the Catholic community, only had been to visit a Catholic school. First time that had happened, visit by a Prime Minister of Northern Ireland to a Catholic school. He'd invited the Taoiseach, that's the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, Sean Lemass, up several years before, and that had upset the likes of Paisley, who'd been there to throw snowballs at Lemass's car. So O'Neill had held an election earlier in 1969, and the Ulster Unionist Party was still the largest party, but its majority was considerably reduced. Anyway, the 1st of May, he stood down. Then there was the new leader. Of course, the leader was actually was appointed by the governor of Northern Ireland. Despite being part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland had a governor because there was a devolution. There was no Northern Ireland secretary in the UK cabinet at the time. So Chichester Clark was in some ways cut from the same cloth as his cousin, but he realised that too much of a reformist attitude had led to O'Neill being pushed out. And the marching season of 1969 was coming, and of course feeling was running high. So there were controversial actions of the RUC in the Bogside of Derry. One man, Sam Devaney, was killed by RUC officers, beaten with them by batons. He didn't die right there and then. So a judge, Lord Cameron, was appointed to investigate this, and he heavily criticised the RUC as being ill-disciplined and poorly led. So the Apprentice Boys parade in Derry on the 12th of August had passed off peacefully for many years, but this time it led to a full-scale riot. The Bogside didn't have the RUC going in there for a while. So Catholic families who were in Protestant majority areas were often told to leave or be burnt out. Some Catholic ex-servicemen formed their own organisation to protect Catholic areas. Up until this time, it was not unusual for Catholics in Northern Ireland to enlist in the British military. Whereas from the 70s onwards, that would be highly unusual and indeed dangerous to do so. Such a person would be in danger of being shot by the IRA if he ever went home on leave. So some Protestants were also intimidated out of their houses, not so much as Catholics. In Belfast, the Catholic community comprised 25% of the population, but there were about 90% of those who had to leave their houses. So graffiti and vandalism also encouraged people to leave. The RUC only had 3,000 men full-time and a few women. There were 12,000 B specials, and there was so much rioting, it was more than the RUC could cope with, and the RUC were distrusted by quite a lot of Catholics. Anyway, the British Army was brought in on the streets to protect Catholic areas from loyalist thugs. The burnings out and the intimidation was on such a large scale, it must have been organised. Remember the UVF, the organisation formed in 1966? They were behind some of this. And the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, Prime Minister of the whole UK, sent the troops. Chichester Clark wanted the soldiers to be answerable to him. But Wilson said, no, this is the British Army, this is for the whole United Kingdom, they're answerable to me and not to you. Anyway, so the army was welcomed onto the streets, and some Catholic people said they'd been burnt out by lawless thugs a couple of times before and were welcoming the soldiers, giving them snacks and tea and so on. Now, some Republican-minded people in the Catholic community were bitterly disappointed that the IRA had not fought back against loyalist hoodlums, and they wrote IRA equals I ran away on walls and things like that. Anyway, so the Troubles was about to get a lot worse.